This outcome is part of the findings of the research project Spatial Justice in Times of Urban Transition, SITO Transitions. Our research from August 2017 till November 2020 was funded by the UK's Department for International Development through its East Africa Research Fund. In order to understand how complex urban land markets influence spatial justice within the current urban transition in East Africa, we studied 4 cities in Uganda and Somaliland as and within integrated systems of given political economies.
In this short video, we're going to show you one approach to studying the physical form of the city to give a much more grounded evidence base and database on which to make policy decisions that impact the land and housing markets. We'll explore some research techniques that were used through the East Africa Research Fund project in Uganda and Somaliland, which will show you how to map physical changes in the city as a means of understanding how land and housing markets work. So why should urban policymakers be interested in land and housing markets? Well, cities are essential for economic growth. As virtually no country in the world has developed economically without its towns and cities growing at the same time. This is a process that we know as urbanisation, where there's a shift from the weight of the population living mainly in rural areas towards a situation where more and more people reside in urban areas. Now, urbanisation is almost always linked with economic development. As cities and towns grow and more people and businesses locate closer together to one another, this gives them an opportunity to engage in a much more diverse and wide range of economic activities. Productivity rises, incomes rise, and poverty is often reduced. So urbanisation should be a good thing. Now, the next 3 to 4 decades will see urbanisation rates in East Africa outstrip those anywhere else in the world. So it's going to be critical for policymakers in East Africa to get urbanisation right. Land is an essential input to the urbanisation and economic development story of East African cities. And land and housing markets are a way of allocating land to various uses, be it economic, institutional, recreational, or environmental. So getting urbanisation right is very much linked to ensuring that land and housing markets operate efficiently, effectively, and equitably. So look around your city. I'm sure you can think of examples of the haves and the have-nots. On one street, large villa-style houses surrounded by large grounds behind high compound walls, where a few streets away, many households living together in small basic accommodation with no running water or public services. So in some senses, the physical form of the city is a representation of the outcomes of land and housing markets operating and a series of trade-offs that households and businesses make to weigh up their needs and constraints. So on one hand, you could accept that land markets are a useful means of sorting households or businesses across different neighbourhoods according to their wealth and preferences. However, for many, it may seem that there isn't really freedom of choice and that they can't imagine a situation where they would be able to upgrade their living situation. Also, some of these smaller injustices at a household level are amplified and compounded at the city scale. Where land is not allocated efficiently, we see negative impacts in the form of pollution, congestion, or pressure on public services. As a process, urbanisation is the shift of the weight of the population living in rural areas towards more living in urban areas. Now, as the population grows, the city also changes physically, expanding outwards and often upwards to accommodate larger numbers of people, particularly as land becomes more scarce. So by studying these patterns and changes over time in the physical form of the city, we're able to say something about current conditions within the city and also future trends and dynamics of how the city is likely to change, or the land and housing implications for how the city may change. Using techniques drawn from urban design and from geospatial analysis and the use of satellite imagery, we're able to go back in time and monitor changes in the physical form of the city to give us some insight into how efficiently or effectively land has been allocated to various uses. East African cities generally have an absence of reliable data. This makes it incredibly difficult as a policymaker to take decisions or evidence-based decisions. Through this research project, we took a number of open source data sets and open source tools to generate some basic statistics on patterns of growth within urban areas in East Africa, which helps frame an understanding of how land and housing markets have been operating. So drawing on a couple of techniques from the urban design world and from geospatial analysis, we used satellite imagery dating back over 40 or 50 years to map and measure changes in the physical form of the city. Now this gives us an understanding of how the city is growing, but it also gives us some insight into how effectively and efficiently the land and housing markets have been allocated land.
In this short video, we are going to show you how the spatial analysis is done using Arua as a case study. Arua is a small city in the north part of Uganda and is one of the 4 cities analyzed in this study. The first thing when we start doing the spatial analysis is try to map the urban fence of the city using the latest available imagery. Once this is done, the second part is to go back on time with the imagery available and try to map for a previous year. This brings very important information in terms of direction of growth and the speed of the urban expansion. Once the mapping of the urban fence is done, we can export the files to GIS. In GIS, we can also bring some data. In this case, we found online data about the road network of Arua from OpenStreetMap, data on the location of slums from the Slum Dweller Federation of Uganda, and also data about the administrative boundaries of the city. The second exercise in the spatial analysis is to map the different land uses of the city. So we are going to bring back the baseline imagery from Google Earth and first divide the city by the main land uses, let's say residential, mixed use, and non-residential. In this case, in blue and light blue, we have non-residential and mixed use. Once the main division of land uses is done, we just focus on the residential part of the city and try to identify different settlement types within the city. In Arua, we identify 3 different settlement areas: type A in red, type B in dark orange, and type C in light orange. These areas can be broadly related to income. For example, type A is clearly a high income areas, while type C, orange, is the low income areas. In order to map all the areas of the residential areas of the city, we start using, in the case of Arua, we have some data from Slum Dweller Federations, so that helps us to start with the mapping of the different types. In this case, we are looking at type C. Type C is characterized by an irregular street layout, irregular urban blocks, small plots, and small dwellings, most of them in very poor conditions. In the opposite end of the spectrum is type A. Type A presents a regular street layout, large plots, and large houses. And type C Type B, as well present a very irregular street layout with pockets of large houses and are pockets of very poor dwellings. Once the mapping of the residential areas is done, we can gather very important information such as an estimate of the population and the density of each type. This exercise needs to be supported by the household survey that was done during the project, just to verify all the initial assumptions.
In the spatial assessment, all the data resulting from the examination of the satellite imagery over time was brought together in the mapping exercise. It is the case that the majority of land in most cities is used for housing people. The principal output for the urban planning and housing policy purposes shown here is a colourful map which shows how our case study city, Arua, is composed in terms of the land that is used primarily for housing of different types. It's important to note also that, strictly speaking, in land use terms, most housing areas in East African cities would be classified as mixed use, with houses, shops, workshops and other uses intermingling within the same neighbourhood. As it's not possible to see what is going on inside buildings from the satellite imagery without a field-based land use survey, it's not possible to say exactly what uses individuals are being put to, although the size of buildings is a strong indicator. And also in the case of Arua, we have some evidence from the sample household interviews survey carried out in the research and photographic evidence. The study report refers to settlement rather than housing types for this purpose, but since the subdivision of land is usually predicated on residential use, and this is the predominant use by far, we refer here to housing types. On this basis, we can see on the map of Arua that there were three main types of housing identified, along with land for mixed uses where commercial rather than residential uses predominate, and also non-residential uses. We combined this data with disaggregated population and other data from the recent population census and modelling to accommodate the likely growth rate of the population, and taking into account that buildings and neighbourhoods overwhelmingly develop incrementally and taking into account the related measures of density of development, we are able to establish reasonably accurate estimates of the average population densities for the different settlement types. From this data, we're able to give us an idea of how much land is being used by what proportion of the population for certain types of housing. As noted previously, the Arua settlement types were identified from the satellite imagery according to the predominant street patterns, how land and buildings are laid out, and the characteristic built form evident from the building footprints and roofs. Drawing on concepts from the theory of urban morphology and taking into account the incremental nature of most of the housing development, a general understanding of the development of these areas of how these areas have come about over time is achieved. Overwhelmingly, the highest proportion of the population in Arua live in settlement type C. We estimate it at more than 100,000 people, nearly 50% of the total. And that also proportionally covers more land than the other two settlement types. Type C is found all over the city, particularly on the periphery, and is a place to observe the predominant form of development in Arua, which is described here as rural densification and incremental housing development. This is where, through the transition process, houses in smaller settlements previously understood as rural villages or scattered hamlets densify over time and become absorbed into the wider urban area as the city expands, at the same time as the plots on which they built develop and become denser as well. We can see here how the urban transition plays out in terms of physical development from examining the three settlement types and their contribution to urban growth over time in terms of land and people. And taking into account their relative population densities, it is possible to gain an understanding how the land and housing markets are operating and how they are allocating land. In Arua, a very small proportion of the population inhabit quite large dwellings, perhaps 2.5% of the total, maybe 5,000 people living in what can be described as villa-style, larger, higher income accommodation, with the majority of the large majority still living in smaller dwellings of rather rudimentary construction. And this is a strong indicator of the underlying levels of social and economic inequality in the city. The observation and measurement of the land and housing trends over time gives a good indication of what land and infrastructure needs are likely to be in the future, if left to the market as it's currently allocating land for housing. And in the context of ongoing urbanisation and the socio-economic differentiation of the population.
Hopefully we've demonstrated through this video one approach that policymakers can take to better understand the urban transition or the urbanisation process in the towns and cities. We've used satellite data and other open source tools to bridge data gaps at the neighbourhood level to give some understanding of intra-urban differences or the differences between different neighbourhoods and settlements. We've also shown how it's important to track trends in urban expansion and settlement patterns over time, with a view to better understanding not just the current situation within cities, but future land and housing needs. Central to this is evidence on which to inform public investment plans and any targeted, for example, pro-poor service delivery, housing or upgrading interventions to allow policymakers to maximise the use of limited resources when trying to address social inequalities. Key findings from our study was that East African cities demonstrate rapid rate of urban expansion and population growth, and that this shows no sign of slowing down. How this growth is managed, however, will be a key determinant of future economic growth and equitable growth prospects of East African cities. Urban land and housing markets are one way through which land is allocated for various uses, and policymakers have an opportunity to intervene or shape the way that these markets operate to try and ensure more just outcomes. This could be, for example, using the evidence collected here as a starting point to assess whether current policies relating to land allocation and land use control are appropriate. Can also be a jumping off point for having discussions with real estate agents, brokers, communities and others to really understand land values and the needs and different preferences of different economic groups within your city.